Most people think intimacy is about closeness, more time together, more affection, more physical connection. But if that were true, then why do so many relationships feel completely empty even when two people are constantly together? Why do people slowly lose desire? Not because of a big betrayal or dramatic event, but because of something much more subtle and invisible. Why does connection quietly fade, not because of conflict, but because of the small moments people ignore? Here's the psychological truth most people never realize. Real intimacy is not built on closeness. It's built on emotional safety. It's built on the feeling that you can be completely yourself without fear. Fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear of emotional withdrawal. And in modern relationships, this is exactly where things start to break. This is Liza from Secrets Inside the Mind, and today we're breaking down the real psychology of modern intimacy. What emotional security actually means, why most people unknowingly destroy it, and how connection is built not in big moments, but in the small ones people completely ignore. Engagement, CTA number 1, around 1 minute. If you've ever felt disconnected from someone you love or wondered why intimacy fades over time, subscribe right now because this video explains the psychology behind that feeling. Keep watching until the end. The final insight explains why intimacy disappears even when love is still there. Section 1. What intimacy really is, the misdefinition. Most people confuse intimacy with 3 things: physical closeness, constant communication, or emotional intensity. But this is where the confusion starts. Real intimacy is something much quieter, much more subtle, much more psychological. Real intimacy is the feeling that you can be fully yourself in someone's presence without fear. Not fear of judgment, not fear of rejection, not fear of emotional withdrawal. That's it. That's what intimacy actually is from a psychological perspective. It's safety, emotional safety. And here's what most people don't understand. You cannot create emotional safety through effort alone. You can't create it by trying harder. You can't create it by being more affectionate. You can't create it by communicating more. In fact, most of the time, when people try to force intimacy, they actually destroy it. Right? Because instead of creating safety, they create pressure. And pressure is the enemy of intimacy. Pressure is what slowly poisons connection from the inside. Think about this psychologically. When you feel pressured to be a certain way, to react a certain way, to feel a certain way, your nervous system registers that as a threat. It registers that as instability. And when your nervous system feels threatened, it doesn't relax, it doesn't open up, it closes, it withdraws, it protects itself. So the paradox is this. The more someone tries to force closeness, the more distant the other person becomes. The more someone demands emotional availability, the more emotionally withdrawn they become. The more someone pushes for connection, the more the connection breaks. This is the core psychological dynamic that destroys intimacy in modern relationships. People are trying so hard to create connection that they're actually destroying the conditions necessary for connection to exist. And the tragedy is that most people don't even realize they're doing it. Engagement. CTA number 2, around 4 minutes. If you're recognizing this pattern in your own relationship, or if you've experienced this dynamic before, like this video and comment below. It helps our algorithm reach more people who need to understand this. Keep watching, because the next section explains exactly how this shows up in everyday moments. Section 2, presence versus pressure, the silent killer. There's a fundamental difference that most people never learn, and this difference determines whether intimacy grows or dies. The difference between presence and pressure. Presence says, I'm here with you. I'm available, I'm open, I'm not going anywhere. Presence is grounded, presence is stable, presence creates safety. Pressure says, you need to respond a certain way for me to feel okay. You need to make me feel certain emotions. You need to behave in a specific way so that I can feel secure. Pressure is desperate, pressure is insecure. Pressure creates tension. But here's the thing, pressure doesn't always look obvious. It doesn't always sound aggressive or demanding. In fact, pressure can sound like love, it can sound like concern, it can sound like care. Pressure can sound like, "Why are you being distant?" When what you're really saying is, "I feel unsafe because you're not responding the way I need you to." Pressure can sound like, "You don't care like you used to," when what you're really saying is, "I feel less important now." Pressure can sound like, "Something feels off between us," when what you're really saying is, "I'm anxious and I need you to fix my anxiety." Even when it comes from genuine love and concern, it still creates the same psychological effect. It creates tension, and tension slowly replaces safety. From a psychological perspective, here's what happens. When someone consistently feels pressured, they enter what's called a state of hypervigilance. They become hyper-aware of the other person's emotional state. They start monitoring reactions. They start calculating responses. They stop being spontaneous. They stop being authentic. And when authenticity disappears, so does real intimacy. Because real intimacy requires vulnerability. And vulnerability requires safety. And you cannot have safety when someone is pressuring you to be different than you are. So the question becomes, how do you create presence instead of pressure? How do you communicate your needs without creating tension? And the answer is actually simpler than most people think. You stop trying to control the other person's response and you start taking responsibility for your own emotional state. You acknowledge what you're feeling without making it their job to fix it. You say, "I'm feeling insecure right now," instead of, "You're making me feel insecure." You say, "I miss being close to you," instead of, "You don't care about me anymore." The shift is subtle, but psychologically it's profound, because one creates pressure and the other creates invitation. One creates tension and the other creates safety. Section 3, the invisible language of intimacy, micro moments matter. Here's something that most relationship advice completely misses. Intimacy is not built through big conversations. It's not built through grand gestures. It's not built through intense emotional discussions or scheduled date nights or planned intimate moments. Intimacy is built through micro moments, small interactions, tiny exchanges that communicate something fundamental. Are you safe here? Are you accepted here? Are you emotionally seen? From a psychological perspective, these micro moments are actually more powerful than big conversations because they happen consistently. They happen when people's guards are down. They happen authentically, not performed. For example, when someone shares something vulnerable with you, something they're insecure about, something they're afraid of, your reaction in that moment determines whether they open or close. If they feel judged, even subtly, they close. They don't share again. They protect themselves. But if they feel understood, if they feel accepted, if they feel like it's actually okay to be imperfect in front of you, they open. They share more. They become more themselves. And here's the psychological mechanism. Over time, these micro moments build a pattern. That pattern becomes the relationship. If the pattern is consistently one of acceptance and safety, the relationship becomes intimate. If the pattern is consistently one of judgment or withdrawal, the relationship becomes distant. And this is why couples who've been together for decades can still feel deeply connected, while some couples who've been together for months feel completely disconnected. It's not about time. It's about the pattern of micro moments. It's about consistency. Think about your own relationships. The moments you remember as creating closeness, they're usually small moments. Someone listening to you when you really needed to be heard. Someone laughing with you, not at you. Someone accepting a part of you that you thought was unacceptable. Someone being patient when you were struggling. Someone not taking your mood personally. These tiny moments accumulate. They build trust. They build a sense that it's safe to be yourself with this person, and that accumulation is what creates intimacy. But here's what happens in modern relationships. People don't pay attention to these micro moments. They're distracted. They're thinking about their phone. They're thinking about work. They're thinking about their own anxiety. And while they're physically present, they're not actually present. They're not actually communicating safety through their micro moments. Instead, they're communicating distraction. They're communicating that the other person isn't a priority. They're communicating that emotional connection isn't important. And that pattern, repeated over months and years, slowly erodes intimacy. Engagement, CTA in there 3. Around 9 minutes. This is where most relationships quietly start to break. If you're feeling this in your own relationship right now, comment below. Tell me which micro moment you need more of, and if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment, because the next section explains why modern relationships are uniquely vulnerable to this problem. Section 4, why modern relationships struggle. The paradox of connection. Modern relationships face a unique psychological problem that previous generations didn't have to navigate. People are more connected than ever before. We have constant communication, instant messaging, social media, video calls, but people feel less emotionally safe than ever before. This is a paradox. Why? Why would more connection lead to less emotional safety? The answer is psychological, because modern connection is shallow. Communication is constant but superficial. Attention is divided. Emotional presence is fractured. And in this environment, people are unconsciously asking a fundamental question: do I still matter to you? But instead of asking this directly, they express it through behavior, distance, silence, irritation, withdrawal. They're testing, they're checking, they're trying to see if the other person still cares. And here's what happens psychologically. The other person reacts to the behavior instead of understanding the need underneath the behavior. They get defensive about the distance instead of curious about why the distance is there. They get frustrated with the silence instead of understanding what the silence is trying to communicate. And this creates a psychological cycle. Person A is struggling to feel safe, so they withdraw. Person B reacts to the withdrawal by becoming frustrated or defensive. Person A interprets this as confirmation that they don't matter, so they withdraw more. Person B becomes more frustrated, and the cycle continues. This is the silent killer of modern intimacy. Not betrayal, not infidelity, not even conflict. It's this cycle of miscommunication where both people are trying to express a need, but neither is understanding the underlying need. From a psychological perspective, this happens because people haven't learned to translate behavior into emotion. They see the behavior, the distance, the silence, the irritation, and they react to it as though the behavior itself is the problem. When really, the behavior is just a symptom. The real problem is the underlying unmet need. So what's the solution? The solution is psychological awareness. It's learning to pause when you see behavior you don't like and ask, what need is this behavior trying to communicate? Instead of reacting to the withdrawal, get curious about it. Instead of getting defensive about the silence, investigate what the silence means. And when you start doing this consistently, something shifts. The cycle breaks. Communication becomes real again, and emotional safety starts to rebuild. Section 5, emotional security, the foundation. Everything rests on. Most people confuse emotional security with reassurance. They think that if they just tell their partner, I love you enough times, if they just reassure them constantly, if they just prove themselves, then emotional security will exist. But this is psychologically inaccurate. Emotional security is not about reassurance. Emotional security is about consistency. It's knowing that your partner's emotional state won't suddenly shift without reason. It's knowing that connection doesn't disappear unpredictably. It's knowing that you don't have to earn closeness every single day. It's knowing that you don't have to wonder if you still matter. Emotional security is predictability. It's reliability. It's the felt sense that this person is stable. And here's what many people unknowingly do. They become inconsistent. They're present one day and withdrawn the next. They're affectionate when they're in a good mood and cold when they're stressed. They're responsive sometimes and distant other times. And they create the opposite of security. They create anxiety. The other person never knows which version of them they're going to get. Are they going to get the warm version or the cold version? Are they going to get responsiveness or withdrawal? And living in that uncertainty is psychologically exhausting. It's like being in a car with a driver who's unpredictable. Sometimes they accelerate, sometimes they brake suddenly, sometimes they drift between lanes. You can't relax. Your nervous system is on high alert. You're constantly bracing for the next unpredictable move. That's what emotional inconsistency does to a relationship. It puts the other person's nervous system on high alert. It prevents them from relaxing into the connection. But when someone is emotionally consistent, something different happens. When they show up the same way, whether they've had a good day or a bad day, when they're responsive, even when they're stressed, when they maintain connection, even when they're struggling, when they don't make the other person responsible for managing their emotions. That consistency creates safety. That consistency communicates, you can count on me. My care for you doesn't fluctuate based on my mood. You matter reliably. And that reliability is what actual emotional security is built on. Engagement. CTA number 4, around 14 minutes. If you're recognizing that you might be the one bringing inconsistency to your relationship, that's actually a moment of awareness. That's where change begins. Comment below if this hit you. And keep watching because the next section explains exactly how intimacy breaks when consistency disappears. Section 6, how intimacy quietly breaks the slow death of connection. Intimacy doesn't usually end with a big event. There's rarely one moment where everything falls apart. Instead, it fades slowly, quietly, through small moments that seem insignificant on their own, but accumulate into disconnection. It fades through things like not listening fully, going through the motions of listening but mentally checking out, dismissing small emotions. Someone shares something they're feeling and you minimize it or redirect the conversation. Being physically present but mentally absent. Sitting together but actually somewhere else entirely. Responding instead of understanding. Hearing words but not understanding what the person really needs. But the most damaging behavior, the one that kills intimacy faster than almost anything else, is making the other person feel like their emotions are too much. From a psychological perspective, this is devastating because emotions are how humans communicate their needs. If someone feels like their emotions are too much, they stop communicating their needs. And when they stop communicating their needs, they become disconnected from their partner. They stop being vulnerable. They stop being authentic. Think about what happens when someone shares an emotion with you and you respond with impatience or dismissal. They don't share the next emotion. They protect themselves. They build walls. And over time, if this pattern continues, the relationship becomes emotionally shallow. Two people living together but not actually connecting. Two people in the same space but in completely different emotional worlds. This is how intimacy breaks. Not through one catastrophic event, but through thousands of small moments where connection is not nurtured, where vulnerability is not met with safety, where emotions are not received with understanding. The tragedy is that most people don't even realize it's happening. They wonder why their partner seems distant. They wonder why sex feels mechanical. They wonder why conversation feels empty. And they don't realize that the intimacy died through 1,000 tiny deaths, 1,000 moments of not listening, not understanding, not seeing. Section 7, the role of self, the biggest threat to intimacy. Here's something most people don't want to hear, but it's psychologically true. The biggest threat to intimacy is not your partner. The biggest threat to intimacy is your own emotional state. If you are constantly seeking validation, constantly needing reassurance, constantly requiring external sources to feel okay about yourself, you bring instability into the relationship. If you are easily triggered, constantly reactive, emotionally dependent on others, you create chaos. And emotional chaos destroys safety faster than anything else. Think about this psychologically. If you're insecure, if you're constantly looking to your partner to make you feel okay, then you're not actually present with them. You're present to your own anxiety. You're present to your own need. And that energy, that neediness, communicates to the other person that you're not safe to be vulnerable with. Because if they're vulnerable, you might need something from them. And they can already feel that you're fragile. So they protect themselves. They distance. They don't open up. And the connection breaks because one person is too needy and the other person is forced into a caretaking role. Real intimacy requires both people to be grounded in themselves. to not need the other person to complete them or fix them or make them feel okay. This is the hard psychological truth that most people resist. People want to believe that their partner should make them feel better, that their partner should reassure them constantly, that their partner should be responsible for their emotional well-being. But this belief destroys intimacy, because when you make your partner responsible for your emotional well-being, you create dependence. And dependence is not intimacy. Dependence is control disguised as love. Real intimacy is created by people who are grounded, who have their own sense of self-worth, who are emotionally aware, who understand their own triggers, who don't depend on constant reassurance, who can be alone without falling apart. These people don't chase connection. They don't demand connection. They allow connection to grow naturally because they're not desperate for it. They're not threatened by space. They're not anxious about distance. And that groundedness, that stability, that emotional independence, it's actually what creates the most intimate connections because the other person can finally relax. They can finally stop worrying about managing your emotions. They can finally be themselves. Engagement. CTA near 5, around 20 minutes. This is the shift that changes everything. If you've ever felt like you were too needy or too dependent, understanding this shift is crucial. Comment below if this resonates. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now because the final section brings everything together.